The goal was evolution, not revolution, and when the final report from the Curriculum and Assessment Review, chaired by Professor Becky Francis, was published on November the 5th, that is precisely what was delivered. Across primary and secondary education in England, the review proposed changes to the system as a whole, as well as individual subjects, with all the changes firmly rooted in the evidence that the review's expert panel had received. The government has accepted a large number of recommendations from the review, but rather unexpectedly, ministers have also decided to ignore some of the review's evidence-based recommendations and instead announce their own reforms. So what were the main proposals in the review's final report? Was the government right or wrong to reject some of the review's proposals? And does the goal of evolution, not revolution, mean that debates over some controversial topics are far from over? My guests are the same two experts who joined me to digest the interim report from the Curriculum and Assessment Review back in April. Mary Myatt, an education advisor, writer and speaker, and Dale Bassett, the Director of Curriculum and Assessment at United Learning, a group of over 100 schools. I'm Tom Richmond, and to find out what the next evolution of our education system will look like, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Let's begin our conversation today at the beginning of our education system in primary school, because the Curriculum and Assessment Review, or CAR for short, felt that some things were missing from the primary curriculum at present. First, the CAR wanted a much bigger role for oracy, which they defined as speaking, listening and communication, because it was seen as important for future study, life and work. But the CAR noted that in the current national curriculum, quote, the attention to oracy is insufficient, hence their proposal for a new oracy framework, like we have for reading and writing, to give schools better guidance on how to develop children's oracy skills. Alongside oracy, citizenship will now be compulsory in primary schools, with a particular emphasis on financial education, media literacy, and climate education. Mary, what do you make of this new direction for primary education? Are you pleased to see oracy and citizenship given greater prominence?
Yes, I am. So while oracy has always been there in both the English national curriculum as it currently stands and in literacy across the curriculum, there have been all sorts of issues with the four elements of literacy. So speaking, listening, reading and writing. And by default, the sector has focused on writing, because that's where we can show whether children have made progress or not. But actually, they need to be fed with the first two, speaking and listening, and also reading. So I'm delighted to see a greater emphasis on that. It's very encouraging because there was some disappointment in the interim review that it wasn't included. So I think supplying schools with greater ideas, resources and structure, and also addressing some of the barriers to oracy, because it's harder to evidence, reassuring the sector on that, I think is a great move forward. Ditto with citizenship. My question on that is the amount of time that primary colleagues already have to cover so much content in the current curriculum. I'm sure with imagination and the right resources, those will be very fruitful additions to the curriculum.
Dale, do you think there are any reasons to be cautious about these proposals, or do you think an oracy framework and compulsory citizenship will be useful additions to the primary phase?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of oracy, the reading and writing frameworks, they aren't part of the national curriculum. They're non-statutory guidance to support schools in meeting the expectations in the national curriculum. And, in an area like oracy, where we know that there is an opportunity to improve practice and where maybe schools sometimes struggle to understand how to robustly develop oracy throughout the curriculum, it could certainly be useful guidance. And I'd say the same's, probably true of the proposed new secondary reading, writing and oracy framework as well. In terms of citizenship, I mean, I completely agree with what Mary said. There is obviously a lot already in the curriculum. And, both the review and the government response acknowledged concerns about sort of breadth over depth. But there is clearly a very pressing need for the curriculum to address important topics like media literacy and financial literacy. So, I think it is important for them to have a proper kind of home to make sure that they're taught substantively as well as being woven throughout other subjects.
Fair enough. So a bit of a thumbs up then for some of these big primary changes. From primary to secondary education, because the CAR had plenty to say about each part of secondary schooling. Let's start with Key Stage 3 from ages 11 to 14, because the CAR and the government have ended up pulling in different directions. The CAR's biggest proposal in Key Stage 3 was the introduction of mandatory English and maths tests in Year 8 to help schools diagnose problems well before pupils start their GCSEs. But the government has rejected this idea and has instead proposed a mandatory reading test in Year 8, but not English and maths. Dale, what do you make of this very clear difference of opinion on what should be tested in the early years of secondary school? Did the CAR get it right, or did the government get it right, or were they both on the wrong track potentially?
Well, so the government seems to have gone for a bit of a halfway house, hasn't it? So they're proposing a statutory reading test, but then a requirement, it seems, for schools to use third-party assessments for writing and maths in Year 8. I've never come across a school that doesn't assess throughout Key Stage 3 anyway. But obviously some schools will do it better than others. And, more support for schools whose practice isn't as strong could be helpful. I would say especially around, good formative assessment and actually using the assessment data to inform better responsive teaching and learning. Schools are often drowning in assessment data. The question is, what impact does it actually have in the classroom? While I can sort of see the rationale and the merit, I do have a few concerns, I suppose. And the first is the impact on the curriculum. So, if you're going to have assessments in Year 8, that could potentially necessitate the specification of sort of mid-Key Stage 3 endpoints, which could risk being over-prescriptive. Whereas at the moment, the national curriculum is set out by key stage in secondary, not year by year. How big a problem that is will depend on exactly what's being assessed. And that sort of brings me on to my second concern, which is curriculum alignment. So, both the review in its proposals and the government in its response say that the tests are intended to be used diagnostically and formatively. That would imply to me that a high level of specificity would be necessary in order to sort of facilitate sufficiently granular assessment to be formatively useful. In other words, it's going to, these assessments are going to have to go into quite specific detail about what students' strengths and gaps are. And that would mean either making the national curriculum a lot more prescriptive, which the review and the government are rightly clear they don't want to do, or you risk having not particularly valid or useful assessments because they aren't that closely aligned to what it is that students have actually been learning. And then my sort of third concern is really around backwash effects. And this is obviously always the concern with any assessment, isn't it? And even if, these are positioned as being solely formative, it's hard to see how testing in Year 8 could avoid the risk of curriculum narrowing. We see that everywhere else that there's statutory testing in the system, including the phonics check and the multiplication tables checks in primary, which are also intended to be formative more than summative. So, those are the concerns that I would have around the proposals, be it the reviews or the government's.
Okay, very interesting. Mary, are you surprised that the government has not adopted the CAR's proposals for English and Maths test in Year 8, or was the CAR being too ambitious, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm mystified as to what's going on there. I wonder if there's a bit of power play between them. I don't know the background to it. I mean, no other comment really on it. I absolutely agree with everything that Dale says, and I'm always particularly concerned about backwash into curriculum provision, particularly if something is high stakes and they might be declaring that it's not, but inevitably it'll be interpreted by schools as being, there'll be some accountability narrative around it, whether it's explicit or not.
Okay, moving from Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4 from ages 14 to 16. Lots of high-profile changes were proposed by the CAR in this space. Most prominently, I think, the plan to reduce the overall GCSE exam time for each pupil by at least 10%, with some subjects perhaps reducing by more than that. As we discussed in our previous podcast earlier this year, I think this was always going to be one of the most difficult balancing acts facing the CAR, because on the one hand, the CAR was always clear that traditional exams should remain the main form of assessment for GCSEs, and we need quite lengthy exams to produce reliable grades that pupils, teachers and parents could have confidence in. But the CAR also stressed very early on that pupil well-being was a serious issue, given that GCSE pupils were sitting around 30 hours of exams at age 16. Personally, I'm not convinced that GCSE chemistry exams switching from 1 hour 45 minutes to 1 hour 30 minutes, or history exams going from 2 hours to 1 hour 45 minutes, is going to make any real difference to pupil well-being. Mary, this desire to protect the reliability and consistency of GCSE exam grades seems to have largely won the battle with pupil well-being. Is that the right outcome in your view?
In broad terms, yes, I think it is. It then depends on, what flows from that. So we do know that our students at the end of Key Stage 4, the number and the length of examinations is significantly higher than other jurisdictions who manage to make some judgments about standards and how well students are getting on. So I think that is a worthy aim. The critical thing will be the extent to which, and I think cumulatively, so 30 minutes here, half an hour there, cumulatively that will add up to reduce it. The big piece of work is with the exam boards to reduce content and to make sure that there is sufficient depth, as opposed to, in some subjects, pretty much a scattergun approach, which is very frustrating for colleagues trying to cover the content and not able to do it in sufficient depth. So I think there is great potential there. It is all going to be how it pans out and is implemented, which will really determine whether it's successful or not.
Dale, in our previous podcast on the CAR earlier this year, you talked about the inevitable trade-off between the length of exams and the reliability and trustworthiness of those final grades for pupils. Do you think the CAR has landed in the right place by only proposing a relatively small reduction in exam time for pupils?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because I think the brief was to maintain broadly the current structure and approach. So, as you say, Tom, will a 10% reduction in exam time massively change students' experiences? No. Will it address the issues that Mary raises with GCSE content being too big? No, in and of itself, although, they might make other changes in that area. But obviously, what it is kind of achievable without tearing everything up and without risking a big change in the reliability of GCSEs. So you can see why they've gone for a fairly modest recommendation.
Indeed, yes. But it wasn't just exam reforms that got people talking about Key Stage 4. Another big change was around accountability. The government has accepted the CAR's recommendation to scrap the EBAC, or English Baccalaureate, to give it its full title, which is a pretty controversial measure of secondary school performance that recorded how many students enter core academic subjects such as English, maths, sciences, humanities and languages. However, yet another source of disagreement between the government and the CAR appeared on Progress 8, which is the main measure of secondary schools, because the CAR said no changes were needed to Progress 8, but the government wants to change it anyway, including the decision to add creative subjects as an equivalent option alongside humanities and languages, whereas at present creative subjects are not one of the requirements of Progress 8. Dale, do you think the CAR was right to want to remove the EBAC but keep Progress 8 unchanged?
I think the review proposed a sensible balance, really, getting rid of the EBAC as a discrete measure, but retaining the EBAC bucket within Progress 8. And I think the review was very, very clear on its position that Progress 8 in its current form should be left alone. The government's obviously ended up in a different place. My concern around that is that the current design of Progress 8 took a while to embed in the system when it was first introduced, but it's now well established. It's well understood within schools, and it provides a good balance between requiring an academic core and allowing pupils to study subjects that they're good at or interested in. My concern around these changes is actually, it could potentially be a lot of change and complexity for relatively little impact on the ground. The changes that the government's proposing, I think, will actually make very little or no difference for the vast majority of pupils who would meet the current criteria and the new criteria anyway. You might see some sort of marginal changes around the edges for some pupils, but actually there's a risk that could result in less choice, not more, if pupils now have to do 2 of 3 of the humanities, languages and creative subjects, rather than having sort of a bigger kind of more open bucket than before. So the review was obviously very clear that Progress 8 should be left alone. I think given the disruption, the potential unintended consequences and the likely marginal impact, that's what the government should do.
Mary, I've seen plenty of support from the creative industries for this proposed change to Progress 8, but I've also seen quite a strong backlash from likes the former schools minister Nick Gibb, who came up with the EBAC and is now very worried about the impact on languages, for example, if we start making all these changes together. So what's your view? Has the government got the balance right, or did the car get the balance right in the first place?
Yeah, my view is the car got it right. I think the big element for me was the removal of the EBAC. The consequences of that in terms of uptake of so many vital subjects was disastrous, is pretty strong, but it did have a big impact. And when you think of it in broader economic terms, you know, what the creative industries contribute as net income to this country, they're one of our biggest exporters in terms of services and goods. To cut off the supply earlier on in terms of students being able to study those because of not that they were denied by the EBAC, but all the incentives were against them. So I found that very refreshing.
I think potentially there is a risk that, voices in the system sort of overreact to the scale of this change. I think it's worth remembering that actually only around 40% of pupils actually do the EBAC. And, only around 44% of pupils take a languages GCSE. And those figures have been pretty static since the EBAC was introduced. There is obviously a very good argument for making sure that, pupils have a strong academic core. And, the EBAC was introduced with very good intentions behind it. But I think this sort of suggestion or kind of implication that at the moment, every pupil across the country is studying, all 5 of those subjects and that everyone's taking a language, that just isn't correct. I'm not saying that we don't need to be mindful of a potential knock-on effect of that and making sure we preserve important things like languages. But I think it probably is helpful to have that debate within the context of what's actually happening. And the fact is that actually fewer than half of pupils currently take a language GCSE or, take the whole EBAC suite.
OK, finally, a quick word on 2 other proposed changes in Key Stage 4. First, the government has accepted the CAR's recommendation for a new entitlement to triple science at GCSE so that any student who wants to study biology, chemistry and physics as separate subjects has the opportunity to do so. And second, the government has strayed beyond the CAR's proposals again by deciding to explore the feasibility of developing a brand new languages qualification that operates like a languages ladder, as they described, so making it more like grade exams for music in which pupils sit them when they're ready rather than at fixed ages. Mary, do you see anything beneficial coming out of either of these proposals?
Yes, in terms of entitlement, the concern is staffing and resourcing. So yes, in principle, how does it work in practice?
Yes, that's certainly going to be a pretty huge question if we're struggling for science teachers as it is already. Dale, what do you think? A new entitlement to triple science or a new languages ladder? Are either of these going to shift the dial on the school curriculum, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, on triple science, Mary's absolutely right. There's absolutely no point having an entitlement that can't be delivered well. That wouldn't do students any good at all. And, to be fair, I think both the review and the government response do acknowledge the challenges around timetable time, resourcing, and especially having enough specialist teachers. So those things really do need to be meaningfully addressed if they're going to introduce this entitlement. I think, in terms of the impact of it, this feels very much in vein with a sort of evolution, not revolution brief across the review. It seems to me sort of designed to tackle the 10% or so of schools that don't offer triple science at all. But I wouldn't nationally necessarily expect to see a huge swing in entries from combined science to triple. In terms of the sort of language ladder qualifications, I mean, it's interesting that the review didn't propose a similar approach for literacy and numeracy, which, is arguably a bigger problem to solve and would have been a much more sort of radical approach to tackling that. I think my view on that is, it's not a bad idea in and of itself. It's hard to see maybe how it fits into the assessment and accountability landscape in most schools. And again, it doesn't really address those underlying issues, especially sort of making sure that there's enough teachers. So, I don't sort of have any particular objection to it, but I'm not sure it's really going to address the underlying issues with languages take-up.
OK, last but by no means least, Key Stage 5 from ages 16 to 19. The big proposal for new V-level qualifications was trailed well in advance of the CAR's final report. Another of the CAR's proposals, which we had already heard about, related to GCSE resits, because the CAR has proposed brand new qualifications at level 1 in English and maths. Level 1 is essentially a pre-GCSE standard, so anyone getting a grade 1 or 2 in their GCSE at age 16 would presumably take these new 1-year English and maths qualifications after age 16 and then try to sit their GCSEs again after another year or 2 of studying. At the moment, students who get a grade 1 or 2 in their GCSEs can sit qualifications other than GCSEs, such as functional skills, but it looks like the CAR wanted these new English and maths qualifications to replace that option in future. Dale, I've heard some people say that these new stepping stone qualifications in English and maths are a great idea in terms of helping pupils master the basics and build their confidence before reattempting their GCSE. And I've heard other people say these new English and maths qualifications are a terrible idea because they just distract students from the necessary content to pass their GCSEs after failing first time around. Where do you stand on this one?
We know and understand, and the data overwhelmingly supports that, there is a fundamental issue with the kind of current GCSE resit grind. So, I think having good and appropriate stepping stone qualifications with a clearer pathway and clearer expectations around that could be beneficial. And I think certainly, for those students who get a grade 2 or below at 16 at the moment, I think it has to be better than that. I don't necessarily think it will be transformative, but I'm optimistic that it could make a difference for some students.
Mary, are you a fan of stepping stone qualifications being made available after age 16?
Yes, I am. I absolutely agree with Dale. I think the experience for so many of our students taking those resits is pitiful, really. And so anything that can underpin that with some strong foundations that's done sensitively and yet robustly, I think must be a good move.
So a big thumbs up for new stepping stone qualifications. To finish up Key Stage 5, the government has yet again gone well beyond the CAR on another subject, this time the subject of AI. The CAR said that, quote, "The best approach to future-proofing students' learning is to ensure they have a strong foundation in core knowledge, and that, quote, we recommend minimising references to specific products or versions of fast-evolving technologies." The government, it seems, has completely ignored this advice and has instead proposed a new A-level in AI and data science. Now, for the sake of transparency, I wrote about this difference of opinion on LinkedIn, and I freely admit I was not very polite about the government's desire to chase the latest tech fad by putting AI into the curriculum, not least because technology will always move faster than a curriculum can. So I think the CAR was right to say that we should focus on fundamental skills for everyone like maths and statistics. Dale, what's your view on this? Is an A-level in AI and data science the right direction of travel?
I mean, I suppose it's worth saying that, both the review itself and the government's response were also very clear that actually there is a need to strengthen digital literacy throughout the curriculum and, building, not necessarily digital literacy in the sense of, how do I use ChatGPT as it exists today, but, more underlying concepts and understanding of how these systems actually work, how they build in bias, all these sorts of things. In terms of the AI A-level, as with any A-level like that, it's only going to be taken by a small cohort. It'll be quite specialist. I don't really have any objection to it, but for me, it's not really part of the solution in terms of broad AI and data literacy across the cohort. So, I think it's fine in and of itself, but, I wouldn't necessarily expect it to be transformative across the system.
Mary, how do you feel about an A-level in AI, assuming, of course, that it ever gets off the ground?
Yes, which is a big assumption. I mean, I love teaching and I love new ideas. I would be absolutely horrified at trying to teach this because any curriculum has a status and a solidity to it. And this space is moving so fast. I just think it's completely unrealistic. A bit like trying to teach USA politics at the moment. That is fast moving, but this is next level. And I'd just be so frustrated trying to teach this from a standardized curriculum in whatever form and keep a straight face. So I don't think it's a starter at all.
Yes, I did make the point on my LinkedIn post that ChatGPT was only released 3 years ago. Here we are in November 2025. ChatGPT was released 3 years ago. It would probably take another 2 or 3 years to design an A-level and get it off the ground, by which point I have no idea where the technology would have gone, but it's certainly not going to be slowing down, I suspect, anytime soon. Okay, we are nearly at the end of this episode, so it's time for my final question for today. The 197-page curriculum and assessment review has received a broadly positive response, I think, because it's stuck to its plan to evolve rather than revolutionise primary and secondary education. But that doesn't mean everyone will agree with every one of its proposals, and the government has already disagreed with the CAR on some topics, as we've discussed today. So, given what you've now seen in the CAR's final report, my question is, which one idea or proposal in the CAR are you most enthusiastic about? And which one idea or proposal in the CAR are you least enthusiastic about? Mary, which one proposal are you most excited about and least excited about in the CAR?
So just by way of prelude to answering that, what's really struck me about this report is how respectful it is of the sector. I think there's a real tone to it of collaboration, of drawing on current research, and I just think it's a really measured and helpful piece of work. All credit to Becky Francis and the team for the considerable amount of work pulling all that together. So I really appreciate that, because quite often I think the sector feels patronised. So what am I particularly excited about? So a big thread of my work at the moment is around Key Stage 3 and shifting it from the wasted years of 2015 Ofsted report to the ambitious years. And I'm really pleased to see those threads of the untapped potential at Key Stage 3. And it's not more work, it's about looking at it through a different lens. But to see that so clearly, I found really heartening, and great opportunities for building on what is taught in primary, as opposed to assuming that our children arrive having been taught nothing in the individual subjects, and in too many cases, reteaching content as though they've not been taught it before. It's one thing to reteach content when I know there are gaps or it's not secure. It's quite another to teach either novels or maths concepts, which were covered in year 4 and 5, and we've got plenty of evidence that that happens. So I'm really pleased that that's going to open up the narrative around strengthening the discussions and the thinking on transition to make sure that Key Stage 3, as I put it, becomes the intellectual powerhouse of the secondary school, as opposed to the waiting room, as David Didow called it in his commentary on the CAR, the waiting room for GCSE. We can do better than that. What am I less taken with? Well, my heart sang when I saw that RE was a recommendation, as I have a background in RE. It's my first discipline. But what I'm worried about are all the caveats around it. I think Vanessa Ogden, if anyone can pull this off, it's her. But this is a very, very tricky piece to actually secure, not least because of all the legal stuff sitting around it and the power vested in the House of Lords and the bishops relating to religious education. It's very complex, and I just hope that there is sufficient goodwill all round to recognise that this is essential for all our pupils and students. At the moment, it's just far too fragmented. There's marvellous stuff going on, but without a proper established framework for religious education, it's never going to be secure as an entitlement for every pupil and student.
Fascinating. Thank you, Mary. Dale, which of the CAR's proposals have left you feeling enthusiastic and unenthusiastic?
Most enthusiastic. I think the changes to English that are among the most substantial in the review and do recognise real known issues with the current approach. So at Key Stage 2, making sure that the writing curriculum and writing assessment framework is supporting pupils to develop fluent writing rather than the more sort of tick box approach that the current criteria can sometimes encourage. And moving grammar to focus on, more effective use rather than knowing grammatical terminology. At GCSE, possibly the English GCSE is going to see maybe amongst the biggest changes. English language is going to focus more on communication, on oracy, on media literacy, and, making sure that the core purpose of that is to read and write effectively across a wide range of text types. And English literature, making sure that there's much more flexibility in text choices, whilst maintaining a sort of a core of the kind of classic canon. Those feel like important changes to me. What am I least enthusiastic or worried about? So I completely agree with what Mary said about the review's respect to the sector and really kind of careful and thoughtful positioning and recommendations. One thing that I'm worried is maybe not that respectful to the sector is the government's intentions around the implementation timescale. The government in its response suggests that it plans to do all of the national curriculum changes in one big bang in September 2028. That does not seem sensible to me. And I find the rationale bizarre, to be honest. The government's response says, quote, a phased implementation of a curriculum can create more disruption to teachers and to pupils, creating discontinuity and lack of clarity. Well, I think my view would be the exact opposite of that. Primary teachers do not want to have to rewrite their curriculum for every subject at the same time. Secondary teachers do not want to have to rewrite their curriculum for every year group at the same time. And there is a risk that pupils end up having quite a disjointed experience, going from the old national curriculum one year to the new the next. I think capacity in the system, in schools especially, to implement large-scale change like this is hugely limited. So I would definitely encourage the government to look again at that timescale and consider phasing the new national curriculum in to make it manageable for teachers and for schools.
Thank you, Dale. That would certainly match the rhetoric that the CAR has been pushing for quite a long time. That brings us to the end of this episode. A huge thank you to Dale and Mary for giving us their verdict on this landmark review of the curriculum and assessment system in our schools and colleges. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.